Ever find yourself kind of baffled by, like, how we actually know anything at all?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's like the fundamental question, right?
Totally. And then, there's the whole thing about the words we use. Like, can they really capture reality, or are we always kind of missing the mark?
That's a question that's been haunting philosophers for ages, for sure.
Absolutely. And in this deep dives, we're going to explore how Tibetan philosophers, like centuries ago, tackled these exact questions with some serious philosophical firepower. Their insights into epistemology and the philosophy of language are mind-blowing.
Yeah, Tibetan philosophy is rooted in Buddhist thought, but it really developed its own unique and intricate approaches. It's a super rich tradition.
Totally. And if you're here with us, you're probably the kind of person who loves digging deep into ideas, right?
We're all about that here.
So think of this deep dive as your, like, curated shortcut through a seriously complex field.
We'll break down the core arguments, those aha moments, but in a way that's, like, digestible,
Exactly. We're serving up the good stuff without overwhelming you. This deep dive is made for you, the curious mind who wants to understand the nitty-gritty of Tibetan thought. And, like, we've got a great starting point. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Tibetan epistemology and philosophy of language.
Yeah, it's a fantastic resource. Super comprehensive and authoritative. It covers, like, a really vast tradition.
Our mission is simple. We want to extract the core ways Tibetan philosophers understood knowledge, reality, and, the power of language and how it can sometimes trip us up. And we'll connect those ideas to broader philosophical themes, ones that we think might, resonate with your philosophical leanings.
Let's jump in.
Okay, so, like, to really get a grip on this, we need some historical context, right?
Definitely. The periodization by van der Kuyp is a good starting point. It outlines 4 main periods of Tibetan epistemology.
All right, so first up, the ancient period. This is like 7th century CE when Buddhist thought first arrived in Tibet. Mostly a time of, like, intense translation efforts, bringing those core Indian Buddhist texts into Tibetan.
Yeah, a key figure from this period is Santarakita. He's known for blending Madhyamaka philosophy with logic and epistemology.
Then we move into the pre-classical period around the late 10th century. Even more translations, especially of, like, Dharmakirti's works and their commentaries. Oh, and something super cool for philosophers is the emergence of new Tibetan scholarly forms, topical outlines, and concise summaries specifically designed to unpack these complex Indian texts.
Definitely. It's like they were creating tools to really grapple with these ideas. And then we see the first independent Tibetan treatises, mostly on epistemology, but, still heavily influenced by Dharmakirti's Brahmajani's Kineth.
Right. And a major player in all of this is Nyingok Lodin Sherab. He was, like, a super influential translator. He shaped early interpretations.
Then, boom, the classical period arrives. And the game changes with Sakya Pandita Kunga Gilson in the 13th century.
Right. And his masterpiece,
The Treasure of Reasoning. It shifts the focus from the Pramacya Vinishaya to Dharmakirti's Pramatartika, which is way more complex. Plus, it's the first time Tibetans start commenting on other Tibetan epistemological works, not just Indian ones.
Wow, so a real intellectual lineage is forming. But I'm sensing some disagreements, too. You mentioned Ngogak Lodin Sherab's influence, but then Sakya Pandita shakes things up.
Yeah, the Ngogak tradition was mainstream for centuries, with figures like Chapacheki Sangye and Nakpasandra Sangye. But Sakya Pandita pushes for a more, like, rigorous engagement with the original Indian text. That's how the Sakya tradition starts.
So not a complete break, but definitely some lines drawn in the sand.
Totally. And these debates, these disagreements, fuel intellectual fireworks between Sakya Pandita's followers and the later Gendenpa and Gelugpa traditions.
Okay, fascinating stuff. So let's dive into the core of Tibetan epistemology. Trad Ma, like, what's this reliable cognition all about?
It's basically their version of pramad in Indian Buddhist philosophy.
Yeah.
It's the investigation into what makes knowledge legit, what sources we can trust.
And all this is happening within a system that classifies mind or mental episodes, blowing, and how they relate to objects, right?
Exactly. They categorize types of objects that can be known and the forms mental episodes can take. And from that, they figured out how to separate the reliable cognitions from the unreliable ones.
Okay, so let's talk about those objects of cognition. They've got, like, a whole system with the appearing object, apprehended object, intentional object, and engaged object. It's pretty granular.
Yeah, and it shows just how deeply they thought about perception and thought and how our minds connect with the world. But it's important to note that while they use similar terms to Indian Buddhism, their definitions and relationships between these objects, especially the appearing and apprehended ones, could differ quite a bit.
Ah, so subtle distinctions that reveal different takes on cognition, even within the same tradition.
Precisely. And it shows how much complexity they saw in the act of knowing.
Okay, let's unpack this debate about appearing and apprehended objects. It seems like a key battleground for different philosophies of mind, right? Like direct realism versus a causal theory of perception.
Right on. The big question is, how does cognition latch onto an object? Direct realism, which aligns with the Vaibhaka school in India and was championed by folks like Chapa, says that the object and the mind knowing it, they exist simultaneously and there's direct apprehension. The appearing object, what pops up in consciousness, is basically identical to the apprehended object, what consciousness grasps.
So like I see a tree and my mind instantly and directly grasps that tree. No middleman.
Exactly. And Chapa went further. He developed a three-part typology of apprehended objects, particulars, hallucinations, and concepts. And he distinguished them based on if they can cause things and how vivid they appear to us. It leads to this interesting idea of sort of experiential disjunctivism, where two mental states might feel the same to us, but actually be totally different, because one is connected to a real thing in the world and the other isn't.
So like if I actually see a fire and someone else hallucinates a fire, even if we both feel the heat and see the flames, the difference is that mine is grounded in a real, causally effective fire, while theirs is not.
Exactly. It emphasizes the role of a mind-independent reality. Now, the causal theory, favored by the Sautrantika school and later by Sakya Pandita and the Gelugpas, is a different beast. It introduces a gap between the object and our knowing it.
A gap.
Yeah, they argue that the external object causes the mental image, the cognition. But because things are constantly changing, the object itself has already moved on, changed, by the time the cognition pops up.
So like the tree I see is actually a split second behind the real tree.
In a way, yes. And this means that only non-conceptual and non-erroneous cognitions, those raw perceptual experiences, truly have a grasped object because they're directly caused by it.
Okay, so I see a tree, but my concept tree is a step removed, a mental construction.
Yeah. Sakya Pandita was adamant about this. He said conceptual cognition works by exclusion, by figuring out what something is not, rather than directly grasping its essence.
Fascinating. So, like, we know a dog is a dog because it's not a cat, not a bird, not a houseplant.
Exactly. But this view raises a question. If there's this gap, how can we be sure we're actually accessing the real world if what we experience is always a step behind?
Right. It seems like we're always playing catch-up with reality. So how did the Gelugpas, who like this causal theory, deal with that?
They came up with the concept of aspect. Lirmapa. It's that a cognition caused by an object takes on a specific form, an aspect that's like its cause. So it's a kind of direct cognition, but not in a way that needs a separate mental copy. It's subtle.
So my mind sort of mirrors the object, but not in a literal picture in the mind way.
Exactly. It tries to bridge that gap between the object causing the cognition and the feeling that we're directly experiencing the world.
Clever. Now, their whole understanding of objects was also tied to Madhyamaka philosophy, right? With its emphasis on the two truths, conventional and ultimate reality.
Yeah, most Tibetan epistemologists were Madhyamikas. They wanted to know if Chadma, reliable cognition, dealt with conventional reality, ultimate reality, or both.
Yeah.
And most thought it was mainly about conventional reality.
Makes sense. So they had to figure out what counts as real in that conventional sense.
Totally. And that led to discussions about correct conventional versus incorrect conventional, like the Indian Buddhist distinction between ultimate and conventional truth, but filtered through a Madhyamaka lens.
And they also used Indian philosophical categories to map their own positions, right? Like the external realism versus idealism and representationalism versus non-representationalism stuff.
Yeah, they use those frameworks to like see where they fit in the bigger picture of Indian thought with the Vaibhakas, Sautrantikas, and Yogacarans.
So they saw themselves as part of a larger philosophical conversation.
Definitely. They were inheritors, but also active interpreters. Like, Chapa started leaning towards a Vaibhaka-like direct realism, while Chimikpa went for a kind of idealism.
And Sakya Pandita.
He and the Gelugpas often presented these different views as a ladder of increasing sophistication, each one getting refined and ultimately refuted in favor of a higher level of analysis.
Okay, cool. And then there's the extension of the real debate about whether things are spatially atomic or extended and temporally momentary or enduring. This is like deep metaphysics territory.
Totally. They wanted to know if the ultimately real things, those causally punchy entities, were like tiny indivisible bits or could be spread out to make what we see as normal objects, and if they existed for just a flash or lasted through time.
So, like, is a table just a bunch of tiny fleeting atoms, or is it a real, solid, lasting thing?
Yeah, and it gets tricky because they had to square this with core Buddhist ideas like the critique of inherent substantiality and the idea that compound things only exist conventionally.
So a table is just a name we give to a collection of parts.
In a way, yes. Now, some, like Taksang Watsawa, were hardcore infinitesimal momentary guys. They said only those tiny fleeting bits are real. Others, like Sakya Pandita, took a more middle-of-the-road stance.
And the Gelugpas.
They, along with some Sakya folks, were cool with saying that normal objects and time-extended things can be real, but not as some ultimate independent things. They have causal power as collections, but not as some indivisible permanent whole. It's a balancing act.
All right, let's switch gears a bit. We've talked a lot about the objects of cognition. Now, what about the cognitions themselves? You mentioned Lorik, the Tibetan system for classifying mental events.
Right. Lorik is like types of awareness or mental events. It's super specialized. Their classifications were tied to their views on objects and how cognition works. There was an agreement on the three basic types, conceptual or non-conceptual, erroneous or non-erroneous, but the big debates were about what makes a cognition reliable within that framework.
So, like, we agree that thoughts can be about concrete things or abstract concepts and that we can be right or wrong, but the real fight is about what makes a thought a valid source of knowledge.
Exactly. And everyone agreed, following Dharmakirti, that perception and inference are the two main types of reliable cognition, Chadma. But defining what makes them reliable, that's where the real fun starts.
Let's start with the passive perception model. What's the gist?
This model, championed by Sakya Pandita, focuses on non-belying, nisloba, and novelty, sarpa, as the key features of reliable cognition. Non-belying means that the cognition is like practically effective, it guides you correctly, it doesn't mislead.
So if I see a chair and sit on it without falling through, my perception of the chair was non-belying.
Exactly. The key is that perception, being non-conceptual, can't fully grasp the nature of the object on its own. It needs conceptual thought to come in and do the identifying, the categorizing. Sakya Pandita used this analogy. Perception is like a seeing mute, while conceptual thought is like a speaking blind.
So I see something, but I can't say what it is until my thoughts kick in and label it.
You know, like perception delivers the raw data, but conceptual thought interprets it. And whether that conceptual grasp happens immediately or not doesn't matter for the reliability of the perception itself. As long as it reflects the real object, it's reliable.
Okay, now, why did some folks move away from this passive model and argue for a more active role for perception in knowing things?
Because they wanted perception to do more heavy lifting, to be more directly involved in knowledge. That's where the indirectly active perception model comes in, with Ungok Lodin Sherab leading the charge. He agreed that perception is non-conceptual, but he said a subsequent conceptual determination is crucial for perception to be truly reliable.
So it's not just about seeing the chair accurately, but also about instantly knowing it's a chair that I can sit on.
Yeah. And this makes a big difference. It separates perceptual cognitions that are instantly followed by the right conceptual tag. Those are reliable from those that aren't. And even allows for, like, degrees of reliability.
Interesting. So reliability isn't just about accuracy, but also about how quickly the right concept clicks in. And then there's the directly active perception model by Chapa. What's so radical about his view?
Oh, Chapa was a real innovator. He took the idea of elimination of opposite superimpositions, and baked it right into the definition of reliable cognition. And get this, he said that perception itself does the eliminating, not some later conceptual thought.
Hold on, elimination of opposite superimpositions? What does that even mean?
It's connected to the apaha theory, the idea that we define things by what they're not. So knowing something is blue is actually about knowing it's not all the other colors. Chapa said perception does this through a three-step causal process. First, you have the raw, non-conceptual perception. Then in the next moment, another non-conceptual event pops up and neutralizes any potential for contradictory ideas to arise. By the third moment, those contradictions are gone. So according to Chapa, perception just directly nails down the object.
Wow, that's wild. So our senses aren't passive cameras, they're actively shaping our understanding from the get-go.
Exactly. It's like our senses are already doing some pre-processing, weeding out wrong interpretations. And this model also introduces direct realization, and indirect realization,
Okay, break that down for me.
Direct realization is like seeing a blue patch and instantly knowing it's blue, no mental detours. Indirect realization is like when that same perception lets you know that there's no yellow patch nearby, even though you're not seeing yellow directly.
So I'm getting information not just from what I see, but also from what I don't see.
Yeah, and this extends to reflexive awareness, too, where we can non-conceptually grasp some features of our own awareness and indirectly features of the object we're aware of.
That's pretty mind-bending. But I can imagine Saki Pandita and the passive perception folks weren't too happy about this. Giving a non-conceptual process like perception the ability to do elimination, which seems like a logical, conceptual thing, seems kind of fishy.
Oh yeah, they pushed back hard. They said elimination is a conceptual move, full stop. It's what concepts do, not perceptions. And they didn't see support for Choppa's idea in Dharmakruti's work. It was a fundamental clash about how the mind works.
Makes sense. And this disagreement about reliable cognition spilled over into how they classified unreliable cognitions too, right?
Totally. In the pre-classical period, they had this 5-part system for non-reliable cognitions. Non-ascertaining perception, post-knowledge cognition, factive assessment, mistaken cognition, jakut
5 ways to be wrong, basically.
Yeah. But Sakya Pandita, being Mr. Conceptual Ascertainment, trimmed it down to 3. Non-understanding, mistaken understanding, and doubt He thought those 5 could be boiled down to these 3.
Why the simplification?
He argued that non-ascertaining perception is redundant because all perception is non-ascertaining for him. It's concepts that nail things down. He also questioned post-knowledge cognition, saying it's impossible for non-conceptual stuff because objects are fleeting, and for conceptual stuff, it's just not understanding. And, most controversially, he lumped factive assessment, making a correct judgment without a valid reason, into doubt. He said even if you're right, it's not reliable knowledge if it's not properly grounded.
So a stricter view of what counts as a cognitive fail. Now, there's one more big topic in their epistemology. The debate about universals, those general concepts like dogness or redness. It's a classic philosophical battleground.
It really is, and Tibetans went deep on this, especially because it affects both their epistemology and philosophy of language. They were split into anti-realists and moderate realists about whether universals are real things.
Let's start with the anti-realists. Who were they and what was their main argument?
Sakya Pandita and his crew were the big anti-realists. They followed Dharmakruti and drew a sharp line between concepts and reality. For them, only particulars, those unique, causally potent things, are truly real.
So the specific dog I'm petting is real, but dogness itself is just a concept.
Exactly. They said universals are mental constructs, useful but ultimately misleading because they mask the uniqueness of real things.
Okay, but if dogness is just a concept, how do we even form that concept?
They used the apaha theory again, the exclusion of the other. They said thinking works by distinctions, by noting what something is not. So dogness is formed by noticing how all dogs are not cats, not birds, not trees, and so on.
So it's a negative definition. We know what something is by knowing what it isn't.
Exactly. But then how do these mental constructs, these universals, let us navigate the world so effectively? Like the concept fire helps us avoid getting burned, right?
Right. If it's just a fiction, why is it so useful?
They explained it through the causal link between concept formation and our encounters with real particulars. So our concept fire arises from experiencing actual flames burning things. The concept itself isn't real, but it's causally connected to real burning particulars through those experiences. So when we see smoke and think fire and then avoid it, we're actually reacting to the causal power of a real particular, not some abstract fireness.
Okay, so the concept is grounded in reality through our experiences, even if it doesn't represent some universal essence.
Exactly. Now, the moderate realists, mainly the Gelugpas and some Sakya folks, weren't buying this.
What were their issues?
They thought if universals are just mental fictions, then reasoning based on them wouldn't be reliable. How could fake things consistently lead to true conclusions and successful actions? They said there must be something real that our concepts latch onto.
So dogness must be more than just a mental category.
For them, yes. The Gelugpas define universals and particulars in a two-way relationship. Universals are what their instances have in common, and instances are the things that fall under a universal. They had strict criteria for what counts as a genuine instance.
So not just any four-legged creature is a dog. It has to have specific dog-like features.
Exactly. And crucially, this instantiation, this link between particular and universal, is real for them, not just in our heads. So a red pen really instantiates penness. It's not just us mentally lumping it with other pens.
Okay, but how did they square this with apoha? That seems central to the anti-realist view.
They use the formula, one nature and distinct exclusions. Rang, digital exon cell the bad. While anti-realists used this to say one thing can be thought of in many ways by excluding different things, the realists said these exclusions reflect real differences in the world. So the shared not being non-X among instances of a universal points to a real similarity, even if it's defined negatively.
So all dogs share the property of not being non-dogs, and that's a real thing, not just a mental trick.
Right. They saw language and concepts as picking out these real commonalities, even if they're defined by what they're not.
Interesting. Both sides are trying to bridge the gap between our concepts and reality, just in different ways.
Totally. And this disagreement about universals had a huge impact on their philosophy of language, which we should talk about now.
Yeah, language is how we express those concepts, how we communicate. So how did they see the link between words and the world?
They used two key terms. Broadbide, what expresses, like the signifier, and broadby, what is expressed, like the signified. They knew that language is made of specific sounds and we deal with specific objects, but language works because we connect generic words with general meanings.
So the word dog helps us talk about all those individual furry creatures running around.
Exactly. They also distinguish between the direct signifier, the generic word, and the directly signified, the generic object or concept. And then the conceived signifier, the specific sound we make, and the conceived signify the particular thing we're talking about. The challenge was explaining how these levels connect, how generic words and meanings link to specific utterances and real-world objects.
And I bet the anti-realist and realist views on universals played a big role here.
Huge. Anti-realists, seeing language as dealing with mental constructs, said it works because we kind of mistakenly equate those constructs with reality. For them, a koha and the causal link in concept formation are key. Words become tied to specific distinctions, X versus non-X, and hearing a word triggers the elimination of those contrasting categories, helping us zero in on the right object.
So fire doesn't point to some real universal fireness, but it signals not non-burning things based on our experiences.
Precisely. It's a shortcut based on learned associations. Moderate realists, on the other hand, thought language captures real aspects of the world, those objective exclusions we talked about. For Galupus, the not being non-X that particulars share is the main thing language picks out, and the universal concept comes second.
So they thought language is more grounded in reality than the anti-realists gave it credit for.
Yeah, they saw a closer link between words and the world. Now, there was also debate about the directly signified, what the word actually points to. What were the different views there?
Laid on me.
For those who said conceptual cognition has an apprehended object, that generic object concept was often seen as the directly signified. Hearing a word would trigger that concept in your mind. And this led to the distinction between the sense of a word, that generic concept, and its reference, the specific thing in the world the speaker means. Some even debated if true synonyms exist, if different words can trigger the exact same concept.
Like, do big and large mean the exact same thing?
Yeah, that was a question for some pre-classical thinkers. But others had different takes. Jumikpa, for example, thought the signified is a generic object mixed with a generic word, suggesting a tight link between word and concept. And then there's Sakya Pandita, always the radical one. He used the term verbal object, skradon, but said it doesn't really exist as a thing in the world or even a proper mental object. He acknowledged that mental images pop up when we use language, but he insisted that words don't really signify anything directly. The real-world object is only signified metaphorically because we confuse our concepts with reality.
So for him, words are kind of like placeholders, not labels for real things.
In a way, yeah. It's a provocative view, but it creates problems for talking about abstract things or even language itself. If words don't truly signify, how do we talk about things with no physical counterparts, or even discuss the meaning of words?
It's like his own view undermines the ability to talk about his view.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. And it's still debated today within Tibetan thought.
It's clear their philosophy of language is just as intricate as their epistemology. Now, let's talk about their theory of definition. They had a unique take on that, right?
Oh, yeah, they did. They had this three-part model. which is unusual. Most philosophies go for a two-part model. But for Tibetans, it's the definiens, the definendum, and then the definitional basis, jija, which is the specific thing the definition applies to.
Okay, so it's not just about defining a word in general, but making sure that definition works for a concrete example.
Exactly. They even compare this to inference, emphasizing the role of definition in knowing things. So defining man isn't just about saying it means rational animal. It's about showing that this applies to a specific person, like John.
So we're not just playing with words, we're connecting them to real instances.
Right, and they used examples like a white calf is called a cow because it has a hump and a dewlap.
Very practical. And what made a definition legit for them?
They had three main criteria. First, the definiens has to actually apply to the definitional basis. Second, it should be understandable without relying on the thing being defined. They said the definiens is substantially existent, art as yod, its meaning is independent, while the defendendum is nominally existent, btax yod. It depends on the definiens.
So you can't define cow as a female bovine if you don't already know what bovine means.
Exactly. And third, the definiens and definiendum must have the same scope. They should apply to the same things. But the definiens should be more specific. So impermanent and causally efficient might apply to the same stuff in Buddhism, but causally efficient isn't a good definition for impermanent because it doesn't directly contrast with permanence.
So it's about precision and clarity, making sure the definition really captures the essence of the thing.
It shows their dedication to logic and clear thinking, even in something as seemingly simple as defining a word.
Wow, this deep dive has been incredible. We've explored the history of Tibetan epistemology and philosophy of language, their ideas about reliable cognition, the mind-bending debates about objects, the reality of universals, the workings of language, and their unique theory of definition. It's amazing how these ancient thinkers grappled with questions that are still relevant today, pushing us to think deeper about knowledge and the limits of language.
Absolutely. As a philosopher, I'm blown away by their intellectual rigor and how they approach these fundamental questions. It's inspiring.
So thinking back, a few things really stick out. The debate about perception, whether it's passive or actively shapes our experience, the idea that universals might just be mental constructs, and their three-part model of definition. These are potent ideas that can really shift our philosophical perspective.
And it's not just historical trivia, it connects to contemporary philosophy too. Their discussions about reality, how we know things, and the mind-world relationship are super relevant to epistemology, metaphysics, and philosophy of language today.
Definitely. And it all leads to a big question for you to ponder. Given the Tibetan emphasis on the conventional nature of reality, how might that change your approach to truth and meaning in your own philosophical work? If so much of what we think is real is actually convention, what does that mean for what matters, for what knowledge is?
And if our concepts are built on exclusions, on defining by negation, what does that tell us about the limits of our understanding? Are there blind spots in our reasoning that we're missing because of this?
This deep dive is just the tip of the iceberg. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry we used has a ton of resources for further exploration. Dive in. There's always more to learn.
The quest for understanding never ends, and engaging with traditions like Tibetan epistemology and philosophy of language is a fantastic way to expand our horizons and appreciate the power of philosophical inquiry.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. Until next time.
Happy philosophizing.